What's up, Koinonia and families? We are super excited to be going through the book of James together. We're going to be releasing a new chapter every other day or so, and we would love for you to watch these devotionals in the context of the full playlist that we'll put together. That way we'll be able to worship together, understand scripture together, and also hear from some outside voices and other opinions and thoughts on what the book of James is teaching us. But without going any further, let's jump right into it. Enjoy. Hey Koinonia, welcome back to our James devotionals. Today we're going through chapter 5 of the book of James. If you have not yet read chapter 5, pause the video now and go do that. Otherwise, we're jumping into it. We're going to break chapter 5 into 3 different parts, and they're all focused on the same theme, which kind of culminates at the end of this chapter, but really is a good summary for what he's pointing at for us in the entire book, in the entire letter of James. And so let's jump into it. Right off the bat, we get a sense of his snarkiness and his sarcasm as he's kind of offering this really pointed rebuke and challenge and warning to the rich people of the world. He's basically saying, if you don't get your act together, if you don't start living your life a little bit differently, you aren't going to experience the fullness of what God has in store for his people. And so who's he talking to? He's talking to the rich people, yes, but in that time, specifically, he's talking to 2 groups of people. The first one is the powerful church leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the chief priests. These people had a ton of power in society at that time, but they weren't leading the faith the way that Jesus would have them lead it. They were very legalistic, focused on doing all the right things, but they weren't living a life of faith. They weren't putting their trust, their hope in Jesus. They weren't letting go of their lives so that Jesus could be the king of it. Secondly, he was talking to the actual wealthy people, the ones who had all the gold cars, the really nice clothes, all that extra stuff. People that would make sure that they had all their things set for them, that they could gather all of these really, really nice things. Basically, he was talking to you and me. Because in today's society, many of us, if we have a roof over our head, if we have a car to drive around in, if we have clean clothes every day, we are considered the wealthy of this world. And this passage specifically is such a challenge for me because I often see that I do not have humility, that I do not have a vision for something bigger happening in my life. And this is what the theme is for this chapter. This is what James is pointing to when he's warning these rich people. He's saying, because all you care about is gaining things for yourself, gaining wealth, gaining power, whatever that is, you don't have a vision for something bigger. Everything that you're doing is for yourself. But the truth is that God is writing a bigger story at all times. And that kind of brings us into part 2 of the chapter where he's talking about patience. He says we need to be patient and persevere, especially through suffering. If you think about our life today, we want everything immediately. If my item comes from Amazon two days later than I wanted to, or it doesn't come overnight, I'm going to lose my mind. And James understood that that is part of a problem that points to a similar lack of humility. You see, when I am viewing the timeline of my life as the most important thing, I'm neglecting to see the timeline that Jesus is working in. Timeline that God has set out for us. And if you think about the early church, the people to whom James was writing here, they are going through persecution. They're starting the church. People are pushing back, and they're going through this persecution, and they're energized about it because they think Jesus is coming in the next weeks, in the next months, in their lifetime at least. But the more and more they realize that might not be the reality, that might not be God's timeline, they started to complain, they started to grumble, like James is pointing out in the chapter there. Because they said, well, I can get through this if I'm the one that gets to see Jesus coming back, if I'm the one that can experience that. You see, their own timeline was what they were allowing to lead their life. But if we can step back and realize that our story, our lives are just a small thread in the grand scale of what God is doing, the story that God is writing, that gives us opportunity to be patient, to persevere, knowing that yes, we have an important part of what God is doing, and in that moment it means patience. Because we're just a small part in the grand scheme doesn't mean that it's not limiting us. That's not diminishing our role. No, God is using each and every single one of us for a purpose. And so often we need to take a step back and get a vision for the bigger story that God's writing in order to fully see how we can fit into that in a powerful way. And that brings us to the third part. And so he's brought us through an admonishment of the rich people. He's brought us to a point to say you need to be patient even through suffering because God is doing something bigger. And both of these are pointing to humility. And so he gets to this end and he's like, this is how you can experience deeper humility. And he says, pray in every situation, every circumstance, whether you are suffering, whether you are sick, whether you are praising God, bring it to God in prayer. And this is why this makes sense, because the more that we can have conversation with God, the more that we can listen to him, the more that we can be with him and spend time with him, the more we're going to get to know him, right? That makes sense. Just like any relationship with anybody we know, the more time spent, the more conversation had with that person, we're going to get to know them. But the thing is, the more we get to know Jesus, the more our eyes are, or I should say, the less our eyes are fixed on our own agendas, our own timelines, our own desires, our own wants, and the more they are attracted to what God is doing in the grand scheme. And that is what brings us to a place of humility. That's what brings us to the place of seeing the vision of the bigger picture, the bigger story that God is going to do. And the more that we can see that, the more we can start to be able to live our lives as an important but small part of that story. And that smallness, again, isn't diminishing our role, but in fact, it's making it more powerful. The small role that we have in God's big story is so powerful because he is calling us to live into that. At the very end of the chapter, he basically gives us a great stepstone to say, here's what we can do. Here's what we can do next. Go out and show others Jesus. Offer Jesus to other people. And basically, this caps the chapter off so well because he walks us all the way through the book of James and giving us tangible things that we can do. He gets to the end and said, now go and do that. And if you're living your lives that way, if you've set up your life around these types of ideas and seeking out humility to God in everything that you're doing, your natural reaction when you're with people is going to be to bring them to Jesus and to show them his love. And that's an amazing truth. Friends, in just a second, a couple questions are going to come up on the screen. I would love for you to discuss them with friends or your family, or just sit and process them and talk to God about them. But as you do so, allow the Lord to kind of shape and change your perspective on your own life in terms of God's story that he's writing.